You look at most dictatorships, they do not want to delegate power at all. In fact, like this was the Soviet Union, the Soviet bureaucracy was so afraid of giving up power that they totally thwarted their greatest attempt at surpassing the United States, which was the creation of the internet. I mean, they really had the chance to create the internet, and there was a big fear about transparency. The transparency of information that would inevitably lead to. That's why they didn't innovate in cybernetics in the way they could, despite having the capacity. There's all kind of reasons I think democracy and the constitutional rights are very important beyond just like some moral platitude. I think they're essential to state building. They're essential to socialism. If you don't have that grounded in the structure from the beginning, it's really rare you're going to get a one-party state that'll just like give up power and democratize. A lot of people are concerned in the United States that George W. Bush is undeniably, there's been a kind of state of exception politics in America, which is extremely troubling and dangerous.
Yeah, and yet you need the state of exception because like one of the radical democratic fabrications is the idea that if you provide a sufficient level of democratic representation to civil society, that will, begin to produce socialism. Right.
Well, like there's a huge correlation between level of democracy and the level of labor participation and labor of like equality. Like there's just democracy and equality are heavily correlated. Like if you look at just the Nordic countries.
Right. So like the issue here though, and like this is what I'm getting at. It's like ultimately, if you look at the way that bourgeois democracy functions, right, what it really functions to do is it, in addressing every single person as man, as subject, right, in creating this kind of veneer of formal equality, right, paradoxically, it actually unfetters, right, a lot of modes of exploitation that exist, right? And this is something you see, like, if you look at, Lasordo's book on liberalism, right, where he talks about how, like, in many respects, like, things like slavery were much more restricted by, like, the ancien regime, right, than they were by the ascendant bourgeois states.
Yeah,
right?
I have a big part of my book that actually critiques that. He's a great scholar, I will say, but he leaves out a lot of stuff.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here with Conrad Hamilton. I am tempted to call him Comrade Hamilton, author of Myth Mayhem, a Marxist critique of Jordan Peterson, which I believe at the time came out with 0 books, if I recall correctly, because I think I saw you on Doug Lane's Sublation Media back in the day.
And I didn't see our respective retirement homes. Yes.
Yeah, and I didn't see your name pop up in my radar until recently, when you have been a co-author of a brand new book titled Flowers from Marx, an anthology coming out with Revel Press, the same publisher actually, where I'll be releasing my book, which I've talked about a fair amount on this show, Freedom to Change Nothing. And Flowers for Marx is a anthology that features multiple authors, some of which the listeners of this show will probably be familiar with. And Conrad Hamilton, who's here with me today to discuss Marxism in the 21st century. How relevant is Marxism today? Do the theories still stand the test of time? We're going to get into all of that. And I think it's important also because by the time you're listening to this, my newest and long-awaited comeback video on the main One Dime channel called Marxism Explained is now out. It's Marxism, but told like a story. And if you haven't watched it already, I recommend watching it. But now on the podcast, I want to get into more like, how is all this relevant today? Because I don't do that in the video. But before we get into the meat of it, Conrad, would you like to add anything to introduce yourself? And the question I was just going to start off with is, what got you into this stuff? Like, what got you into Marxism?
Yeah, I thought it was funny your remark about Marxism being like a story, right? Are you telling Marxism like a story? Because I feel like, there's some kind of meta dimension to Marxism where like it should be this great story, with the great last act where there's this kind of, triumphal rise of the proletariat, world revolution, etc. But then it turns into, maybe appropriately this awful social realist drama, at the end, everything kind of fails. Okay, this seems to reaffirm, the inevitability of capitalism and so on and so forth. So that got me thinking about that. And there's a lot we could say about, Marxism as a narrative, talking about Jameson and people like that. But your question,
I more meant like the story of how it happened, how they came to the ideas that they came to in the context of the time. Because if you look on YouTube, it's just these explanations that are very rigid, that are like, the labor theory of value says this, it says that. It's not like contextualized, right? And I think it's way more powerful to contextualize it.
yeah, well, I think it's like, this actually reminded me of Frederick Jameson, right? Because part of his point about Marxism, most notably in The Political Unconscious, was that, people have criticized maybe the narrative or teleological properties of Marxism, but in a way, you always need a narrative to represent like the unconscious dimension of history, right? So you can't just pretend like everything's just contingent, and like history actually has a kind of narrative dimension. If we look at the economic development of societies, for example, right? If we say a society goes from, agriculture to industry to post-industrial, it's like, well, that's not necessarily absolutely going to happen in every case, but there is like a kind of automatism within our economic structure that makes it that way, right? So it's like you need narratives in some sense, in order to represent. So that's my very long way of saying that I think this is a very good initiative. But how did I discover Marxism? I think I had a strong attraction from the time I was like pretty young. And I have like a serious explanation as well as like a funny explanation. And the funny one is that I grew up in, a pretty prosperous town in Southern Ontario, Guelph, near Toronto. And, maybe in a certain way.
Canada mans. You're a Canada mans too.
I'm from Canada. Are you Canadian? You went to York.
I'm based in Toronto right now. And
really?
I lived in Ottawa, Montreal, Vancouver, but I'm in Toronto now.
Okay. I lived in Ottawa too for a year, unfortunately. Oh, it's okay. It's nice in the summer.
We all hate on Ottawa.
Yeah. But no, it is really nice in the summer to get there. But okay. But about this, I grew up in a pretty prosperous, kind of town near Toronto, but 150,000. I think in a way, maybe in a certain sense, it was predestined I would discover these ideas because, or sort of get into Marxist intellectualism, because the two biggest industries in our town are auto parts manufacture, which is Linamar, and the university, right? And not only that, but the Communist Party of Canada was actually founded in Guelph in a barn outside the city in 1921. So there's a really rich and suggestive history with respect. But, I think, it being a fairly prosperous place, really it was quite sort of left liberal ideologically. I mean, I think it was often characterized as a kind of hippie town, right? Hillside, like the folk festival and all these kind of things. But, when you're growing up, right, you always have this kind of, not always maybe, but like Margaret Mead, is youthful, anxiety and rebellion inevitable. But, you often have this kind of rebellious streak. And when I was growing up, it was like, yeah, man, like Eminem, yeah, Marilyn Manson, and then this was like a pre 9/11 environment. So, even throughout much of the 90s, if you were watching a movie, like who was the bad guy, right? It was always, the Russians, always, the Soviets. And then you start to think like as a kid, you're like, oh, if that's bad, then it must become cool, and that, with that very sort of trite and juvenile initial impulse, I think maybe you begin to develop something hopefully a little bit more substantial. But there's a more serious explanation I have, which is that I think that, very often we talk about Marxism in a kind of geopolitical way, like this country is Marxist, this country isn't Marxist. And that's very relevant, if we look at, and there are, profound reasons for that in terms of global colonialism and imperialism in the history of this. But, at the same time, sometimes we can forget that there are Marxists everywhere, pretty much every country, right? In some cases, discreet or concealed, has people who subscribe to this view. And I think a big part of that is because, there's just a tremendous repression in any society of class difference, right? Of the kind of social determination, which is so often a part of this. So for me, I think that for whatever reason, I think that as a young person, I felt a certain kind of sensitivity to that, even in the seemingly, again, fairly affluent kind of quasi-suburban environment, you could always see the discontents, as anyone can anywhere. So that's my explanation. That's my story.
So there's a stereotype, right, of like people who get into Marxism who are already well off.
Yeah.
And it kind of is this paradox of like having the time energy needed to actually be able to read and learn stuff. And like, but like at the end of the day, who's supposed to use Marxism as a weapon? It is the working class, but it's not like, Marx, of course, and I'm saying this for the audience, you already know this, that Marx didn't think change was going to happen by everyone reading Marx and, coming to this conclusion that way. It was rather that like, he thought that the working class just were already going to, be responding to the objective conditions of capital and are going to be compelled to rebel. It's just a matter of like, where do you guide socialism? And it's kind of where he intervenes into the world of it. And that's what I want to get into, is like, to what extent is Marxism, like how relevant and true is it still? Because when, even at the time when him and Engels made it onto the scene, they weren't the only socialists in town, right? And anyone who's read the manifesto knows that, and the other socialisms he critiqued. And today, Marxism is not even far from the majority of socialists. You could say that it's fringer. So first off, I mean, what makes Marxism necessary as if you want to call it a lens, a tradition, I'll let you, however you would frame it, as a discipline perhaps, needed for socialists today, or for people who just maybe want to see change in their lives?
So we have to kind of go back, and I think it'd be useful to talk about some of the things that you're introducing to the conversation. So when you say that there's a stereotype about it being something that favors people of a certain kind of privilege because they have the time and the ability to study it, of course, that would be true of Marxist intellectualism, right? Or any kind of intellectualism, right? I mean, you look at intellectuals who represent any kind of ideology. And, there's a great text, which I love, Louis Althusser's introduction to the 1969 Guimaraen edition of Das Kapital. And in it, he says that, the tragedy of Das Kapital historically is that it runs into this paradox of reception, because the people who are most able to immediately identify with the experience of exploitation that it describes in great technical detail, often struggle to read it, right? Because there is a level of, education and cultivation you need to get there. And then there are people who have a greater level of education, but because a lot of them come from a higher social class, a lot of them will instinctively reject the contents of the book, right? Because it doesn't dispose to their class standpoint. And then I think that that's actually really important for understanding like the evolution of Marxist intellectualism. So why is it, I don't want to, give credence to some kind of terrible like Judeo-Bolshevist trope, but there were a lot of Marxist intellectuals who were Jewish, obviously, Luxemburg, Trotsky, I think Lenin and Marx had some kind of partially Jewish lineage and so on. And we might ask why that is. And I think a big part of it was because, you had people who were, more urbanized and who had developed a certain kind of literacy within their communities, but at the same time, they were excluded from the social order, right? A lot of them were prohibited from owning property, for example, which seems like it would be very germane to the cause of Marxism, as surely as part of the argument of the Communist Manifesto, for instance, is that it's the removal of property, right? The stripping of property from the working class that is priming or preparing them, right, for the transition to communism. But anyway, what I want to get point here is that would be true of Marxist intellectualism, but to apply it to Marxism as a whole seems to me to be more of a Western reflection on what has been a successful attempt, or a successful campaign, as it were, to confine Marxism to the fringes of society, right? To make it into an academic subject, right? That doesn't, animate practical institutions, right? And we can see this within the history of the American labor movement, for example, in the post-World War II era, right? All of the sort of, pressures to create a sort of decommunization and the reactionary standpoint of the Teamsters, the enormous pressure people in different walks of American civil life were subjected to with the advent of the Cold War to not embrace Marxism as a guiding ideology. But then if we look globally, right? Like, it's like, if we were to talk about Russia or China or Vietnam or, as well as the very large, and imminently practical, as it were, Marxist movements that exist in countries like India and the Philippines, would you really characterize that as being something that is, inordinately intellectual and that caters to people who are of privilege, as it were? I see the same thing with this idea that, Marxists are white males. I know it's a bit of a cliche in the West.
Yeah, I think the stereotype of the educated thing is not so much that Marxism is essentially everywhere, like is essentially this way. It's that the tendency, or that it should be relegated to the academy, it's that it just tends to be where it's most prominent. Like you are more likely to find these days Marxist intellectuals than you are Marxist labor organizers, which would be kind of a paradox.
But where? That's
in the West. Yeah.
In the West. Yeah. So that's all I mean. But the West is,
I would say honestly though, like even in Latin America, from what I've seen.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
some countries it's like nowadays or historically. Like historically, I think yes, the third world is definitely way more prominent. But now it's kind of declined. But it's besides the point. I don't really want to.
But even in France, like the CGT is like a pretty politically left-wing union compared to like a lot of what you would get in a more American context, right? They supported the French Communist Party for many years, right? More recently, they've supported people like Mélenchon, right? Insoumise,
Italy, very big communist party back in the day.
Yeah. The Italian Communist Party was huge. So I just meant that, but I see the same thing with the idea that Marxists are white men, which is kind of a reflection of the same thing, which is the transformation of Marxism, or the successful marginalization and transformation of it into a kind of academic hobbyism. Well, I mean, I guess in that context, in terms of the things you're describing, having the free time to pursue it, then there is that demographic skew. But like, let us not forget that, in many ways, the big shock of the 20th century, right, was that it was not the most developed countries, right? It was not the white men, as you were, who turned out to be the ones that galvanized, successful revolutions, right? It was happening, throughout the non-Western world. And of course, even in Russia, of course, Slavs weren't considered exactly white. When the revolution happened, right? Transformation of racial categories. So I just put that in as a bit of a caution about the way we approach history. But what did you want to ask me the other night? There was another thing you wanted to get to.
Well, the main question, it was just to start off, because that opens up many questions, is, why is Marxism essential? Because you see a lot of people who are moving leftward. That's undeniable, right? You see also a lot of people moving rightward. And I think overall, though, you do have an emergence of class politics, just period. It's just not really in a Marxist direction, but I would say, like, of course, like Bernie Sanders, AOC, those are obvious examples. Corbynism in Europe, you had Podemos, you had a bunch of movements like that kind of failed before, right? Like Podemos and the one in Greece. But you also see on the right, the right is increasingly tries to tap, or at least like kind of co-opt class conscious talking points, like with Bannon, right? It's class politics. Why is Marxism essential today, in terms of like what it brings to the table? This is that kind of elevator pitch for the people who are deciding, why should I care? Why should I get into this?
Because it's the closest thing we have to an objective and scientific way of understanding reality, right? And, we're going to talk throughout this a little bit about Louis Althusser and his claim that Marxism is a science. I won't get into this now. But, whatever position one comes down on in that respect, maybe a more diplomatic way of phrasing it would be that it's the closest thing we have to a scientific approach to history, right? Looking at society, right? Asking how do people actually reproduce themselves materially, right? That gives you like a very good linchpin for understanding, any kind of historical society, and looking at the class fissures, right? That really drive our society today fundamentally and are mystified by a lot of these discourses. I'm always struck because, of course, what you're talking about really here is like, the role that class plays in our current discourse in a kind of mystified and aestheticized way, right? That it's not, because this is like what American politicians or Canadian politicians or bourgeois politicians in general are very good at. They're very good at obscuring the fundamental dividing line in our society, which is between bourgeoisie and proletariat, or rich people and poor people, if you will, and creating all kinds of other divisions, right? Like it's straight against gay, it's white against black, it's women against men. And all of these things like have a reality, right? In terms of the way they index to a larger class matrix or system, right? You can't dismiss that. But the fundamental, right, dividing line in our society, right, is between people who are forced to reproduce their own labor power as a commodity, right, and people who benefit from exploitation. But, there's a very actually interesting, I was just looking at an essay that was talking about this, but in 1844, there was a workers' revolt in Silesia. And there's a debate between Marx and Arnold Ruge at that time. And, Ruge said, well, the Prussian state is just responding to this by invoking the need for Christian charity. And this is symptomatic of, Germany's political underdevelopment at the time, because it wasn't like France or England, right? At that time, Germany developed later. And Marx responded like, no. He's like, the underdevelopment of Germany is like the real symptom here of the underdevelopment of Germany is our idealization of the politics of, quote, advanced states. Because far from revealing the truth of reality, right? The transition from feudalism, right, to a capitalist society, right, to a capitalist state, actually mystifies to an enormous degree the real social evils of our world, right? Or the underlying causal mechanism. So he says, like, look at England, right? That epitome of progress, right? You have the superstructure appears as the cause of the base. In other words, politics and political parties, right, are what, social problems are attributed to. And everything becomes personalized, right? Attributed to politicians. Oh, you're poor, right? It's because you don't work hard enough, right? And then you have all these kind of noxious theories of social Darwinism that penetrate the society. And Marx said, this is what you see, right? The more developed the state is, right? The more effective mystification, right, we witness with respect to the real causes here. And then I think it's like really important to understand, like, if we look at the United States today, right? And kind of like the insanity of the political discourse and the irrationalism, right? Not just the United States, obviously. But I think the United States is interesting because in a certain sense, it is like the most ideologically advanced bourgeois state, right? So it's gone so far towards making it impossible, right, to actually understand what's going on in a fundamental sense, pervading society with ideology and dividing people on other grounds, that it's almost, it's even harder in a paradoxical sense than it might be in a less developed society if you had some semblance of education in any case.
Yeah, America is notoriously one of the least class conscious societies. There's no such thing as, poor people in the United States. There's no working class. There's no middle class. There's temporarily embarrassed billionaires. That's the famous.
I thought it was
saying.
millionaires. No, it's billionaires. I guess we're upgrading.
I guess, yeah, inflation. You gotta adjust it.
Well, not just inflation. I don't think inflation in the number of rich billionaires. I mean, Jeff Bezos' wedding is 50 million though, so it makes sense that millionaire wouldn't suffice anymore.
Yeah. Well, in Canada, $1 million will, that's like enough to get you a middle class home at best, right? In like Toronto and Vancouver, which is crazy. But that's Canadian. Anyway, the thing I was going to bring to is when it comes to Marxism's relevance, I think I would off the bat just say it's kind of obvious to anyone who's listened to this show, like the way in which I tend to approach things is very much influenced by historical materialism. And for me, that is the biggest value as a lens, in that I don't think other theories are very as rigorous when it comes to that. It's such an influential method that it's kind of even tacitly accepted by people who aren't Marxists. Well, a lot of the time they just will use it differently. But like, this, it's basically like Marx seeing what he was doing is kind of what Darwin was doing for science, but for society, really, like analysis of society. Like kind of economic Newtonianism, if you will, where people tend to say, is it still relevant, are in a few things. So now you mentioned that class gets mystified. Bourgeoisie, proletariat. A lot of people believe that these are no longer relevant categories. Or some argue whether they ever were good categories. But I think they definitely, at one point in society, were very much a big way in which people understood class. A lot of people argue that less so that like a bourgeoisie doesn't exist, like that capitalist class doesn't exist, but rather that a proletariat. How do you define that now? And I'd like you to kind of elaborate on that.
What are we talking about?
So what is
this is the problem with all of, like, because you're telling me, and I'm not criticizing you, by the way, like I think it's very important to discuss this. You're talking about these conceptions people have, and so many of them are really limited by like their own geographic or class understanding of reality. So the irony, what I always find with the charge you're describing, the irony of this is that Marxism, like if you look at the model of Das Kapital, which is kind of an abstract model of like a kind of Platonic form of England or something in its industrialization, right? When Marx wrote that, like how many countries had fundamentally industrialized? Not that many. I mean, like Holland had gone through it very early. They had the first stock exchange. I think they had a tulip, crisis, because the tulips were the basis of value, and then it exploded, right? Like Bitcoin or something.
Yeah.
And England, obviously, and there were other countries that were in the throes of industrialization, certainly, but it was very limited, right, in terms of the actual geographic scope. Now you look at it today, it's huge. Right, industrialization is so expansive. China has the largest, right, proletarian working class in human history today, right? So this is like the irony of this is that yes, it is true that in the West, the substantial exportation of industrial jobs has generated like a certain amount of ambiguity with respect to class position, an ambiguity that in some ways would be interestingly very different, but an analogous in a certain way to the ambiguity that people like Lenin and Mao encountered when they were going to make revolution, because Russia was not like a comprehensively proletarianized society before the communists took power. It was the communists that did that, actually. Thank you. Not China, even more so, right? It was like a peasant society. So we do encounter certain ambiguities. I don't think we should be too discouraged by that, at least in the sense that there has been societies that are similarly nebulous with respect to
that's not what I'm getting at. I think a vibe I get so far is I think you're used to encountering a lot of anti-communist claims, so I think you are interpreting every question.
No, I'm not saying you're. By the way, I'm responding to people in the audience who might share that. I'm not responding to you. I know you're giving me,
but like I'm more getting at the explanatory power of Marxism. Okay. So reason why people say, why is the proletariat still a relevant category, or if so, is there a way in which like we should understand class in a more difficult way, in a more nuanced way? Because I mean, it's notorious, right, among Marxist academics that there's more, as one of my mentors put it, there are more Marxist theories of class than there are Marxists. In that, like, there's a few things that have changed, particularly in the developed world, that kind of add complications. One is, like 401ks, the fact that you have, a lot of members of the, traditionally working class, insofar as they primarily earn through labor, right? Where they're situated in the means of production, they're workers, they're not capitalists, yet they'll own a certain amount of capital. They'll also own a home, perhaps, and have a certain vested interest that would definitely make them quite different from the way, like a proletarian with nothing to lose but their chains, right? And that's kind of what I'm getting at there. And also also introduce the so-called professional managerial class, right, as a kind of strata that changes after the post-war era. So that's kind of what I want you to kind of demystify this, and also see like how do you, in what ways Marxism is still a relevant way of understanding class? Because I think we are already in agreement that class is important, but as a way of understanding class, because you got people like Domhoff, right, or C. Wright Mill's elite theory, or other parts of sociology, who would like to see things more in terms of like middle class oligarchs, and you'll have elites. Like there's like there's different ways of understanding class. So that's kind of the way what I'm trying to get at, is like, why Marxism?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, this is like a very contentious issue because Marx never wrote authoritatively on, like, he never had a scientific kind of description of how class would function as a category. So we're left to kind of tease it out from his writings. I think that there's been a real importance in the 20th century to a nuanced kind of class analysis for exactly the reason that I described, because so many of the countries that were actually developing very large communist movements that were even taking power in some cases weren't coming from environments in which proletarianization was pervasive. And certainly if we look at, a lot of Marx's notebooks, like, or essays and so on, like 18th Brumaire, right, we find like a much more supple kind of analysis, right, in which he talks about, the way that different kinds of coalitions are forged between different kinds of classes in order to take power and so forth, which is going to become very important for Gramsci, right, in terms of the theme of hegemony. But like, I think it's this kind of thing where it's like, it's not that everyone would ever be a proletarian, right? Especially on a global level. Like, you're always going to find places where that's not the case. I think the real importance, right, of the, bourgeoisie proletariat distinction, the way that it functions as a kind of archetypal binary, right, within Marxism, it has to do with the fact that if you look at the fundamental conditions for social modernization, like, what is that? Right? So even if we look at, the capacity for people maybe in non-proletarian roles to function, to educate themselves, to experience a certain level of material prosperity, in the West over the last few decades, that was because proletarian labor was being outsourced, right? It was still, in a sense, the engine, right, for that kind of, material and cultural subsistence. So it's not like everyone is going to be, a bourgeois or proletariat, but it's that, the rise of the proletariat signifies the possibility of modernity, much as industrialization itself, right, signals this tremendous elevation of productivity that then allows Marxism to take birth, right? Because Marxism emerges, like this is the problem historically, right? In a society that, has such a limited productive capacity, it would be, in a certain sense, reasonable to conclude that, okay, well, if we want to have, leisure or intellectual production, that predisposes a kind of more or less compulsory labor being imposed on other people, right? But when you have this profusion productivity, when you have this tremendous breakthrough, then it allows you to think of the possibility, right, of bestowing those freedoms upon all, right, through a different kind of ownership of production and consequently a different kind of distribution of what's produced, right? So again, I think like it's never going to be adequate to just take these categories and try to, subsume all of reality within them. And I would stress that I don't think that in Marx's real political analyses, particularly in the latter part of his life, that's what he did, right? Sometimes some Marxists do that, but I do think that it forms a kind of, again, archetypal binary or necessary condition, right? For any kind of, for a revolutionary project, because it's a necessary condition for capitalism itself and modernity itself.
I guess to say the more important aspect of the question I want to get at, which I think is the most tangible thing about Marxist class, is that is the proletariat, the working class, still the agent of revolutionary change? And for the listeners, I want to add some context. I mean, for people who've seen the video, will already see this, but the reason why Marx saw the working class at his time as the agent of revolutionary change was not just because he thought they were the most poor or the most oppressed or just that he liked them for some reason. It's because they, one, had the interests to usher in the next phase of society, unlike the bourgeoisie, who were the previous revolutionary class, but in a capitalist system are now a dominant class and don't have the interest to really create a system that lives up to their own ideals. And, you know, it was a working class who we thought would win the battle of democracy. But why not the peasants? Why not women? Why not slaves? Why not all these other oppressed groups? It's because they had the power, right? They had this power to organize. They were all in these industrial factories in big cities. They had a lot of capacity to organize and also produce the value in society. Like all that wealth that was being created in capitalism, the people who are doing the work have a lot of damn interest to overturn that system. Now, in today's world, right, is the working class still the agent of revolutionary change? And that's why I like add that context, because some people think that in a world where there's far more people in between, right, and as well as the working class doesn't necessarily have nothing to lose but their chains in the first world, right? I mean, third worldists, right, take this to crazy. You know, if you might not think it's so crazy, but a conclusion that means that like the working class actually isn't, in the West at least, a agent of revolutionary change, because they have a lot to lose. I don't personally believe that, but that is an argument, right? And some might say, due to like artificial intelligence, due to the globalization of world trade, the working class has less power to organize, hence the decline of labor unions, and given the fact that it's easy to ship jobs across the world to the third world mainly. And it's created a different condition. So that's kind of why I'm asking, like, do you believe the working class is still like the agent of revolutionary change, or does change require a kind of different constellation of class forces?
Right. So the difficulty of answering this question is that it would be too easy to talk about some kind of, halcyon past in which the working class was the agent of revolutionary change. Right.
Well, I don't. Chris Catrone would think that.
Chris Catrone would think a lot of things, I'm sure.
Right.
But
well, I mean, like a lot of Marxists would still think that. Of course, you mentioned, right, like Mao and Lenin were in a position where they, that they weren't the majority, so they had to rely on peasants as well. And I mentioned this in one of my videos as well. So like they had to adapt in their time. They were like, okay, well, working class agent of revolutionary change is not really working. We have to not going to work for our circumstances. So that's kind of why I bring it. Like in the West, Marx thought that made sense in the only places that were industrialized when he was alive, right? Like,
yeah, his vision's already becoming quite a bit more complex toward the end of his life, right? Which you see with respect to his recognition of like the importance of anti-imperialist struggles, and again, like the conception of different kinds of class coalitions and things like this. Like, the sort of thesis of, an imminent simplification of class contradiction and consequent revolution is strongest in the Communist Manifesto. It's treated in sort of a bit of a Platonic way, which is sort of how Das Kapital functions in that text. But again, we do find a discrepancy with a lot of what Marx is writing in terms of a more empirical political analysis.
Well, I mean, you could say it's in all of Marxism up until Mao, I would say, because even with Leninism, while there was, of course, a recognition of the worker-peasant alliance and the need for that, ultimately they still believed in, a dictatorship of the proletariat in which the proletariat was really the primary agent that was supposed to be prioritized at the level of power. And they had a kind of rocky relationship with the peasantry, famously, right?
Yeah.
I kind of like add these, and you're like, we're not, the society, Western countries, and even China today aren't in the situation Mao was in, where it's like mostly peasants. We are in these hyper-industrialized societies, advanced industrial societies. You'd think the working class would be more of an agent of revolutionary change, but many say it isn't. So that's kind of what's prompting the question.
Yeah. So historically, so let's be clear, like historically, the working class in the West accomplished a lot, right? Because, if you talk about, I mean, even if you go look at the list of demands in the Communist Manifesto, the 10 points, right? It's like, like public education and so on. Like, I think in any modern Western welfarist society, I realize that welfarism is itself in decline. In any modern Western welfarist society, I think like 6 of them have been fulfilled or something, right? So, what Marx saw as capitalism, is not exactly what exists today in the West. And it's certainly not what existed in the more redistributionist climate of the 1950s or 1960s. So the working class actually accomplished a lot in the West as well. But, what happened is that it stopped short of creating a revolution, right? And some might point to that and say, well, then Marx is wrong, right? But the thing is, what's really powerful here is the causal mechanisms and the way that he explains them, right? So if you look at Das Kapital, right, there are like different interpretations of Marxist economics. Some of them are more underconsumptionist. Some of them lean more on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, but we could say the basic idea here is that value comes from labor, right? And so, with a increasing in automation, you're going to see a depression in the rate of profit, right? Also, workers are not going to be able to actually buy enough things, right, to keep the economy going, which is another important factor. And there's going to be this sort of class disparity or fissure that becomes so egregious that there will be a revolution, right? Now, that didn't happen in the West, right? But it only, in a sense, didn't happen because the ruling class recognized that was a problem, right? And, particularly in World War I and II, right, there was this need to, in a sense, compensate people, right, for the mass mobilization and the risk of death that these conflicts entail, right, which became the occasion to pursue like a massive expansion of the state, right, that in of itself would create quite a different form of capitalism than anything Marx imagined. And of course, all of this was egged on also by the threat of revolution emanating from without, right, because in the same time you were having revolutions all over the world, right, so pressure was being added in that sense. So the working class, has accomplished a lot. Obviously, if we look at the experience of the 20th century, what we're going to discover in China, for example, and China had like tons of peasant revolts, right, before Mao, is that there are other class blocks, right, that are very capable of creating change. But nevertheless, right, again, getting back to the point I made, right, in a way, and regardless of how they frame themselves, particularly and ideologically, right, they were all influenced by the kind of social objectivity that had become a feature of capitalist society and of the proletarian class. Lukács, the proletariat sees reality objectively because it is objectified, right? So there's a kind of social objectivity that they were influenced by or trying to instill. And also they were all in some way, shape or form agitating towards the possibility of a larger global break that would, redistribute proceeds of industry or commerce on a much larger basis based on a different system of ownership, right? So again, they're all like really, even if they weren't proletariat in that context, they were all very influenced by it. Now, today, I see the working class as being as decisive today as it ever was, right? It's like I said, like there's a reason why the proletariat is privileged within the writings of Marx. Now, we can talk about the exact degree or whether he got it right here or there, right? But I said bourgeoisie, proletariat, industrialization, and we can talk about, the importance of financialization and all of this, but we might also pose the question of how real that really is with respect to, how our economy really functions. But in any case, I think it's very important today. I think it's always been very, very important. But I also think that, one of the features of the people who were able to strategize effectively in terms of making revolutions in the past is that they weren't limiting themselves to that, right? They were looking around, right, at different social blocks, right, different kinds of subclasses and so forth, right, and trying to determine how they could appeal to them, right? And I know sometimes you have these very, very funny debates, right? Like, is a barista like really a proletariat or whatever, right? And, again, Marx never wrote his scientific testimony on class, so we can probably argue these things in different ways. But, you know, I think what interests me in a certain sense far more than a kind of abstract delineation, you know, is the simple fact that even if you were to say, oh, that person is not a proletariat, does that mean you shouldn't try to organize, keeping their interests in mind? Right? Like, how would that be a recipe for success? Right? Like, you know, are you going to conclude that, oh, well, there are large swathes of modern Western society that aren't proletariat, ergo we just shouldn't organize them? Like, you're not going to win.
Yeah,
if you do
of
that.
course. Okay, so this is, I can already tell you come from a certain understanding of Marxism, which is already like presupposing that Marxism is infinitely adaptable, which, you know, it's then on the other hand, there's the classical Marxist types, right, who will want to more insist on the writings of like classical Marxists like Marx, Engels, Lenin, Kautsky, and kind of nothing after that, maybe Luxemburg. But what I say is important because, like, yeah, of course, there's tons of groups that are not just the working class who are oppressed. Should we not organize them? Right? It would be ridiculous not to. But that's the thing. Like, kind of what made Marx, like, his whole point very different from a lot of the other socialists is he didn't think the peasants were revolutionary in the same way that the working class was. There were a lot of peasants revolts. There was a lot of slave revolts, even in like the United States or Latin America. But ultimately, he thought it was the working class due to their relation and the means of production and their capacity, which, you know, that's a pretty big point. And like part of why people end up dropping Marxism is precisely because they thought that there's all these other groups we can organize. Like, it's not like in the cases of the third world Marxism that you mentioned, they didn't drop Marx's doctrine while also organizing outside of just the working class, you know, relying on the peasants. But like Western communist parties, France, you mentioned France, right? The PCF. Originally, working class was the Bloc, but over time, there was like a tendency to say, well, actually, like, what about women? What about different, right? What about LGBT people? What about ethnic minorities? You know, eventually, kind of what is, you could say now, I mean, to the left today, what the agents of change are kind of, you could say, a broad category of, if I don't want to put it polemically, the vulnerable, like it would be a polemic way to put it, but you could say the oppressed.
Right.
And that's kind of what I'm getting at. So
Yeah,
a lot of Marxists respond to this by saying, well, we need to go back to the working
Yeah.
class. And it is a difficult and tenuous, very, very tense debate, right?
Yeah. Okay. So I, you know, I see this question dialectically. By the way, on the subject of women, we know, you know, the charge of an insufficient feminism, you know, in France in the late 60s was also related to the kind of ossification of Marxist movements and some of the particular positions adopted by the French Communist Party. But of course, there's a whole other history we could get into here, right? You know, the Soviet Union was the first state that legalized abortion, right? They even flirted with the abolition of the family with Columbine. They were the major drivers in bringing women into the workforce internationally, which the U.S. later responded to, right?
Yeah, the abolition of the family stuff was a disaster, but I won't get into that.
Yeah, well, you know,
women's rights.
They didn't really do it.
Women's
right?
rights, I support that. They were like great on that issue. Stalin, not so much. When the abortion was kind of regressed there a little bit, but definitely Lenin and after. But like the abolishing the family stuff, I mean, the collective child rearing, even Lenin kind of ended up dropping that because he was like, we can't do this at this time. Mao did it too at the beginning, and they dropped that as well.
At this time,
this is my opinion, the worst idea in communism, but we can agree to disagree.
Well, you have to do it. You have to do it eventually, right? I mean, like, you know, and that's the origin of family, private property in the state. I mean, you know, it's like, you know, the arc of communism itself would be away from, you know, the patriarchal family. But
but that's the thing. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to collectivize child rearing forcefully. Like, I think if collectivization of child rearing were to ever happen, it could only happen naturally if there are social relations that are already communistic that build the social trust that would make that just happen by itself, like kind of like how it happened before. Like the reason why there was collectivistic social relations at the level of the family was because of the conditions, right? The economic conditions and like geography too, that like allowed for that. When you get like massive urbanization and people having to move to different jobs, I mean, that's just, you don't get that social glue that makes like collective child rearing remotely possible. So when people hear Marxists say we need to abolish the family, what they hear, and frankly, not wrong to hear that, is like government, like childcare, basically being the socializing, the collectivization of child rearing, basically being like, child rearing being outsourced to government childcare daycare centers, which is very different from the likes of like community child rearing in places where there's actual social ties that are built, that are natural, right? Which,
No,
like,
no,
I
agree. I agree with you, though I would add, and I think it's important to point this out, that, because the process of modernization, has gone hand in hand with increasing proletarianization in a lot of respects, right? Including the introduction of women into the labor force, a lot of child rearing has been collectivized already, right? So when you send your kids,
it's not good.
Public education, like that's already
it's not good. That's what I think. Like capitalism is abolishing the family, and it's caused all this mental illness. What do we want to accelerate that?
Well, I'm not saying that's the ultimate form of it, but I just meant to say that, maybe a kind of dialectical precondition. Okay. But your point's well taken about the need to
accelerationism.
Your point's well taken about the need to actually alter. But about this debate, I just see it quite dialectically, in the sense that I think that, it's like, if you look at a place like China, it's like, Marx's thesis regarding the primacy of the proletariat, insofar as he did assert that thesis, wasn't disconfirmed by what happened there, right? Because, they were able to achieve, significant growth and development and widen education and healthcare. I mean, I think when Mao came into power, the average age was 35. When he left, it was like 65, right? That's pretty huge. But, ultimately, the more voluntaristic designs of the Cultural Revolution didn't succeed, right? And there's a great book by Wang Fengxi, who's actually a Chinese Trotskyist, about this, called Mao Zedong Thought. And in it, he talks about, it's amazing because he had faced a certain level of persecution in China, but he's very generous in his assessment, in a way. And what he basically says, and I think it's one of the best books on Maoism, he says, like, they were right to go to the peasantry, which we as the Trotskyists didn't do. And they completely outmaneuvered us in that respect. At the same time, right, the fact of having to construct socialism upon this non-proletarian foundation did lead to certain deformations that, adversely affected them down the line, and for all their successes, right? So this has been the issue, right? It's like, for us to really achieve, of course, what Marx was, hoped to achieve, right? What he was attempting to militate for, would require, the most advanced proletariat of the most advanced countries in the world to join it, like that kind of revolutionary effort. But my only point was, like, where I get a little bit annoyed when I talk to people about this is, it's like, even as we acknowledge that there are limitations, right, to the approach you're describing, right, class coalitional, okay, organizing the oppressed, when people are like, imply that somehow that just like shouldn't be done, or it's like completely illegitimate from the get-go. And it's like, well, if you're China, right, second poorest country on earth, right, people died of huge, famines, and even after the communistic power for the first, the end of the first decade, and all this, like, the only countries in the world that have really overcome poverty at a mass scale, right, non-Western countries, have done it through the adoption of socialist systems and delinking from the world market. 200 million out of poverty in the USSR, 800 million people out of poverty in China, right?
Yeah. Well, okay, I would definitely say I'm very much for acknowledging those successes. But yeah, I mean, it's not just delinking from the market. That is not true. I mean, there's Japan, there's South Korea, there's Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan's kind of what compelled China to even do. It's like
you can't really, I mean,
Deng Xiaoping admits that. Like, Deng Xiaoping straight up says that Taiwan's growth relative to China was an embarrassment to the nation of China, which is like why he was calling for reform. Like part of the many reasons.
That as it may be, you have to look at the particular conditions, because, like, if you look at Japan's actual imperial policy was different than other places, right? Because when they went to these places, they actually industrialized them, right? Which was not the dominant tendency if you look at Western colonialism and imperialism and how it functioned. Now, in
not
many
the
cases,
dominant tendency, yeah, for sure, definitely not the dominant tendency. I just mean, like, South Korea was
what
like
that meant
South
is
Korea
that
was
Japan
poorer
was
than North Korea. South Korea was poorer than North Korea when it started off. I mean, they were like both poor Korea as a whole was like extremely poor
Right.
before, you know, like
And not
the
only changed in the late
after the Vietnam War.
1970s,
Yeah,
right?
not
But
Vietnam
you
War,
know,
sorry, Korean War.
well, it was, I think North Korea was more developed until the late 70s, but we could dispute the date. But like, by the way, the level also of like
Yeah,
US
it's close
support
for a while.
and technology transfer that was given, you know, like it's just crazy. Like you look at the Vietnam War, like the huge contracts that were given to Korean companies, right? You know, it's like they actually paid, my understanding is actually paid Korean soldiers in the Vietnam War the same level as American soldiers, which at the time was something like 30 times the average income in Korea, you know, and anything the US had, like in terms
Yeah,
of just
there's
right?
the broader point I'm making is not that like capitalism's inherently better or whatever. It's just like that the idea it was only these socialist countries that were able to industrialize out of poverty. I mean, that's not
Well,
really true.
no,
But
at a mass
Singapore,
scale. So anything else to me would be, you know, and it's like those are the much more populous countries than anything you're talking about, right? They're more
mm,
populous than Korea. They're more populous than Japan, even, right? So, you know, anything else I would see as Japan's interesting to discuss, but these other ones mostly you're describing, I would see more as outliers, right? You
and I
know,
mean,
and
even
again,
China's most of its poverty reduction comes from linking itself to the world market.
right. But then we have to ask ourselves, how did they have that success? Right. Samir Amin has a great essay on this, right? And he basically points out that, like, if you look at the policies that were adopted by China in the 80s, you know, basically favoring light industry and service, right? They're not so different than the policies that were adopted by India. And yet at the same time, it's like, even today, India doesn't have a single language that over 50% of the population speaks, right? It has one of the least efficient management cultures in the entire world, right? So it's like, if we look at why China actually succeeded in the context of industrialization, why it became such an effective receptacle for foreign investment, that had to do with the fact that before you saw the highest growth rates in history under Deng, you saw the highest rates of growth that anyone had seen pre-Deng under Mao, right?
I
It's,
thought
so
it was the
again,
Soviet Union before Deng's China. Like, so Soviet Union was still growing a lot more than Mao's China did.
well, I think the point when we talk about
Mao's
growth,
policies seem, from what I've seen, like to be kind of not as successful as the likes of the Soviet Union, just because he wanted to industrialize in a much more way that was nicer to the peasants, frankly.
we can debate the respective successes of their economic policies. And if we're talking about the success of economic policy, you might have a point, because obviously, while China did have massive breakthroughs, there were some serious hiccups there, put it mildly. But, you know, it's like, at the same time, we know that growth is diminishing returns. So like, even the position that Russia was starting from was considerably more advanced than China, right? At the time of their, in a relative sense, at the time of their revolution. So it just follows that, you know, while growth was obviously enormous in the context of Stalinist industrialization, that, you know, coming from where China was coming from under Mao, that they were able to really, I mean, it's incredible, right? Look, some of those years were like, I think there are years with 16% GDP growth, you know, going on in that time. So, you know, it's a measure of their own backwardness prior to also that the growth rates were as high as they were, right? But nevertheless, you know, much higher than places that were similarly backward and large, like India and so forth, right? So I just stress that, you know, the success, or I guess, you know, that China's experienced, you know, in the period of a kind of equivocal relinking is already conditioned so much by the success that came before that. And that's a part of the narrative that's conveniently excised, like from Western histories, because we just want to focus on home markets, you know, blah, blah. But it's like, you know, it's kind of funny. Like, you know, often like when people will brag about how much capitalism is achieved, they'll be like, oh, 1 billion people have been raised out of poverty, you
And
know, in
it's
the
all in
past.
China.
It's like 800 million in China. And it's like, well, this was like, you know, this is a socialist state officially that, you know,
Well,
maintains, well, the 50% public economy and maintains a high level of regulatory control and oversight, right? So we can say,
I mean,
okay, well, it's half Friday.
sure, I'm less interested in the kind of semantics of it, but like a big part of where I would dispute the capitalist claim that like China's success is a sign that like every country can do that by just doing more capitalism. And also the idea that their success comes from quote unquote socialism. I mean, part of like, I think you cannot separate China's success in like doing the kind of reform that it did from the fact that it just has a huge labor force that makes it very competitive compared to any other country in the world. And it developed the skills necessary to have a skilled, huge labor force. And that I would say is thanks to the Communist Party, due to all the education, literacy rates, life expectancy, stuff like that. I mean, they really did prime a skilled population. And the fact that that population was so big it made, it's one of the, there's a reason why so much Western capital entered China, but it didn't enter Eastern Europe after Eastern Europe, got rid of socialism. Eastern Europe couldn't do capitalism well because it's like the capitalists aren't going to invest in Eastern Europe. They would invest in China when you have a gigantic workforce that is pretty skilled. But also the fact that, I mean, like, China just did like kind of completely curtail labor unions, like extremely aggressively under Deng Xiaoping, to a point where like they would suppress wages, which made it even more attractive to Western capital, and also devaluing their currency. There's a lot of reasons for China's success, but
and I'm not trying to romanticize or whitewash any component of that. I mean, these are, and I think part of what you're getting at, which is true, is that if we look at the establishment of, conditions for the success of markets throughout history, there has often been, a strong centralized social authority, right? Capable of kind of coaching their development. So inevitably, this is part of it. But, when you talk about I totally agree with you. When you talk about, how the large population being a huge advantage. Like after 1989, the US went to sanction China. And I think those sanctions lasted like 6 months or something, because it was like, oh my God, we can't do this, right? But, that in of itself is impossible to fully dissociate from, the history of Chinese communist organizing, which was aimed at a kind of national reclamation project. Because remember that when they started, right, you had all different kinds of colonial enclaves, right? I mean, I live in Shanghai, right? It's not obscure to me, right? The British founded the city around 1840, right? And basically it was a center for the opium trade, right? So you had financialization of the opium that was being produced in India and then being shipped in China to produce like this huge social addiction, right? People were making money off it. And HSBC was the bank most involved with that, which stands for Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Company, by the way. And there's a reason they just use the acronym. Oh, so yeah. But I guess like all I'm saying about this in terms of, what I want to get back to the point about this is that like, if you go to a situation like that, and we can come up with like a balance sheet of successes and failures or whatever. But the point is like, would you tell people at that point, like, no, don't try to build socialism because like you don't have the right class constituency? I mean, by all evidence, and comparative examples of that scale, they did, as good or better a job than anybody. So it's like,
what do you mean by socialism, though? Because I think actually Marx's original, in many ways, stagist theory that Kautsky dogmatically stuck to was kind of right, and I think they all kind of tacitly ended up agreeing, because, like, in that, like, what did Lenin realize after? He ended up listening to Bukharin, being we need an NEP, a new economic plan, to do a little bit of like mixed economy to develop the productive forces. And I frankly, so I'm not a Maoist, so I think China's decision to build out the productive forces was necessary. I don't think socialism was possible under Mao, at least in terms of like, if you mean low phase communism, in the sense that like China has. I don't think China is like low phase communist in any sense, but China undeniably has better preconditions for socialism now than it did 30 years ago or 50 years ago.
And this is exactly the point, right, that I'm getting at, right? Which is like, even if you're in this kind of paradoxical position where, it will turn out to be a precondition of, the achievement or possibility before socialism for you to go through this process of like developing yourself to get to, something resembling a capitalist level of the development of the productive forces. All kinds of complexities with that. But like, would you tell someone not to try that? Because by all evidence, people who were, draping themselves in the mantle of socialism, were just more successful with this kind of development than people, in similarly mass contexts who weren't. So, and I would apply this back to the current situation, right? When it comes to, I was giving the example about baristas in this debate, right? Or anything really, right? It's like, I think that, there should be a kind of Marxist horizon within organizing itself, right? And I think that helps. I think that you have to be realistic with respect to, your capacity as like an isolated cellule or whatever to actualize those conditions. But it's like, I'm not going to tell someone to not try to organize because those people are from, quote, the wrong class. Right. And similarly, like, if there's maybe it's an organization in a sense, but like, if there's, I don't know, some like British aristocrat professor, you know, at Harvard who decides that he wants to, you know, commit himself to the proletarian cause. It's like, oh, we can both sit here and say like, well, you know, there may be limits to what he'll be able to accomplish as an intellectual who brings all these class biases to it. But are you going to tell him not to do that? You know what I mean? Like, so this is where I get frustrated with these kind of purity arguments with respect to like, I think you have to understand the differences. And I think you've been pointing that out. It is important, right? So we have to so really grasp that. But at the same time, that shouldn't turn into some kind of like weird political a priori where it's like, oh no, like,
yeah,
no.
like you're, yeah, no, I'm not. I want to. So usually when I bring critiques or try to represent them, I want to represent them at their best, as opposed to like the worst versions of them, because then it's like low hanging fruit. Why are we talking about these guys? Like, you know, the people who think baristas is like are just like, oh, you know, they're not part of the struggle. It's like, you know, that I don't take that stuff seriously. But there's I think undeniably something has changed in that it's not just like factory workers the left has to rely on. There's far more groups that can be part of a coalition. I think the critique about this, I'll call it, you know, Catherine Liu likes to use this word, the kind of vulnerable. And when I was in my conversation with her, I used the term popular front of the vulnerable, and she liked that term. Because it's like, I mean, you look at the way what is the left today, it does kind of consider its constituency like a group of a really incoherent group of people who are held together by nothing other than really like an identification with oppression and vulnerability. And my critique of that is not so much that it's not even just that that's a bad strategy, because like obviously it's been more successful than like just we're organizing on the basis of workers only, or else people wouldn't be doing this strategy if it didn't have work at all politically. But I don't think it would work in bringing socialism, because what is like ultimately, how do you have radical change happen? You need parts of your constituency to have actual power. And what I see happening is that, you know, the left in its kind of in this intersectionality approach of like, you know, this popular front of the vulnerable, it's not looking at like where the vectors of power are. Because if we're talking about like getting groups that have an interest in changing society and bring us closer to socialism and having the power to do so, well, it's like workers would be part of that equation. You could say even skilled workers, tech workers, managers. You can even see some like to say, you know, who are really revisionists according to Marxists, the petite bourgeoisie, small business owners, you know, can be part of that step. I mean, actually, Mao thought the national bourgeoisie, right, was kind of a progressive, could be part of an alliance. This is what I'm getting at. And my critique personally of like where the left is today is that I think I agree that it's not just factory workers. However, what I think Marx is right in his thinking, which we should learn from, right, is the classes that actually like really ultimately matter the most when it comes to socialism are the ones who have the power and interest to change, right? Like that's a big thing, the power. Because like that's the thing, the left today is a bunch of students that don't exert the same level of power at the level of actual production. You know, like a bunch of students protest, like May 68 is a perfect example, right? Like why that failed completely. May 68, mostly with students, and then you had workers. All de Gaulle had to do is like give wage increases to the workers' unions, which were, you know, organized by the Communist Party. And then the students, they just waited for like summers to start.
And well, the real reason May 68 failed,
or start school to start.
The real reason May 68 failed, and I will say this, it's because the Soviet Union didn't want World War III in Europe, right? Because it's like, you know, what really was happening was that, you know, and there, like, this game had been played.
Didn't back revolution, in other words.
Yeah, and this game had already been played. Like, this game had already been played with the war in Algeria, right? Where, like, you know, the French Communist Party would not come out fully against it, right? They had a slightly different thesis according to which Algeria, we should like work to do sort of like what the Soviet Union did and raise its standard of living, which is, you know, defensible in its own way, but also was like a little bit irrelevant because the conflict had already progressed to a point where that wasn't possible. But they avoided, you know, unambiguously supporting Algerian independence, you know, because like to have a nation at war and then to take that position, given the largest of the French Communist Party, would probably generate a civil war, right? Which would then potentially erupt into other European nations. And the Soviet Union was pursuing a policy of détente, right?
Interesting.
In
So
West,
do you buy yeah, I've heard that the Trotskyists often argue that, which is like, yeah, that it was because they didn't back revolution. Do you think May 68 would have succeeded if the USSR was willing to back revolution in Europe? Because personally, I don't think there's any scenario in which May 68 would have ever really succeeded, due to the fact that, like, actually the most part of this protest itself was students who did not exert the same kind of power that workers did. And
well,
I
there
think
was a
you really
reason.
see
Well,
that.
the
You see that in
workers,
the
joined-
election
the
result a
workers
year
joined
after.
them.
Like,
The workers joined them, right? Like that
well,
was
not
actually
really, but like that's the thing. To what extent actually?
huge. This is Althusser
Because,
is a
like,
whole-
how do you
Althusser
explain de
has a whole
Gaulle won
essay.
a supermajority in the 69 election? Like, after that happened, people didn't expect that, right? This is where you get the silent majority idea.
Yeah,
Like, de Gaulle won a supermajority. If really, like, you'd think if so much of the working class supported revolution, you would at least get, like, Communist Party come second place, like it did in Italy.
I mean, there's
Not
never
even
been
close.
there's never been a society where like industrial proletarian labor is over half the population. So like, it's quite possible in the context of electoral politics for him to get his political victory while the working class is substantially opposed to him. That's not a contradiction. I'd have to look at like the particular data on this issue. But by the way, Althusser, we talk about a great deal in the book Flowers for Marx, because to a large extent, it's a debate between kind of Marxist humanism and Marxist science, and democratic socialism and Marxism-Leninism. But Althusser has an essay on this, and he talks about how the problem, in a sense, of some of the students was they didn't recognize that, like, the entire basis of their movement becoming a truly national one, right, or a truly large scale one, in any case, was, the intervention of workers. And I think it was specifically the police brutality against students in the Marais, right, when there were images of extreme violence, right, and then you had like unions joining in, that it really began to become much bigger, right. But I mean, in terms of your point about, do I believe that it would have been successful if the Soviet Union had been willing to pursue, World War III? I mean, first of all, they didn't want nuclear war, right? Which is part of the reason why they were avoiding direct agitation within Western countries. But second of all, like, it's certainly, there's a reason why they were avoiding beyond just the threat of nuclear war, which is that, the US and the Allies had a strong military grip on Western Europe, right? So, do I think that it could have gone further than it did? Yes, but I think they were also realistic with respect to potential limitations, right? And we saw the limitations on the other side with Hungary and the Czech Republic, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. Those are also limitations that existed for the states of Western Europe. And I think, part of the argument in Italy for Togliatti, joining in Berlusconi's government.
The Italian Communist Party, for those.
Are you Italian, Tony?
No, surprisingly not.
Okay. What are you, like Albanian or something? Are you something that
I'm
Italian
mixed.
proximate?
I'm very mixed. The part Tony comes from is you could say perhaps the New Mexican part, which New Mexican is just Spanish settlers and with indigenous blood, with Pueblo blood in my case, and then German and Lebanese. I'm half Lebanese. Like, that's my biggest chunk.
Okay, so some things that are Italy proximate. Anyway, okay.
Yeah, Mediterranean. Well, Lebanese are the Italians of the Middle East, they say.
Yeah. And Beirut is the Paris of the Middle East. Okay, sort of mixed. But no, and I think that, part of the argument for, the demilitarization of the Italian communists, right? And it's complicated. Like, we look at the trade-off of Poland and the Czech Republic for the Mediterranean that was going on between the USSR and the UK and the US. But, I mean, I think there was it Molotov who sent a letter to Togliatti, and he basically said, like, prospects of partisan victory in Italy are at this time, he said, quote, extremely unrealistic, right? So, there were reasons behind their position. Like, it wasn't just something they invented or.
I agree with this. So this is not my objection.
Yeah. But about your point, and I want to be clear here when I talk
It's
about,
because
like,
they're anti-religion stuff. Honestly, if the communists stopped their anti-religion dogma, they would have gotten way more support. I think that single-handedly tanked communist potential, just like atheism. I really think that, like in Italy especially. But yeah.
I'm not even sure. I'm not even sure how real that was. Like, it's like so in China they were opposed to, like, sort of messianic religions that were associated with
China's
or an
like
expansion.
a little unique
like,
when it comes to religion, isn't it?
Sorry,
Like,
it's what?
China's a little unique when it comes to religion in that it's always had a plurality of religion and kind of
Yeah, well, so
already
this is the
most
biggest
dominant religions are hardly a religion.
Yeah, it seems
Confucianism.
important to talk about. Like, it's the biggest population that experienced like state.
Yeah, but that's what I mean is when I say tanked, when I say anti-religion tanked Marxism's potential, I mean like Catholics and Muslims. Like, I mean, like, we can't act like that wasn't a real barrier to communist popularity. I mean, I would like part of why people floated to the Christian Democrats so much is because of that. You know, that's a big part of it.
Yeah, but a lack of anti-religiosity would also be a problem too. I mean, Zizek has made this point about Yugoslavia, and he's like, you know, in Yugoslavia they were very much like, you know, okay, you know, everyone can have like a bit of their religion, you know, their cultural particularity, you know, Bosniak, okay, Croatia.
Because you didn't want to be like Enver Hoxha and
Yeah,
force people to be secular only for after the regime falls. For
Albania didn't have a conflict that was that awful, and nor did.
What are you talking about? They stamped it out by force. You couldn't leave the country. Well, Albania, I think, was the worst.
They had terrible crackdowns. What I meant is they didn't have something like the Homeland War, which was this sort of horrific and genocidal ethnic conflict, right? So all I'm saying is like Zizek will make this point about you know, I think he does know something about Eastern European politics. Whether you agree with all his positions or not, you'll make this point, which is like that, you know, in a way, the very possibility of that was already extinguished, you know, in Russia, because like they were so much more extreme in terms of the crackdown on religion. Now, you know, we can talk about other factors, right? By comparison, of course, Russia had like at least like a kind of orthodox majority, right? You know, which you can argue made it, because they actually were much more tolerant of religious practice with minorities. Like that's what people always forget, right? There was like a real double standard because they were very careful. They didn't want to offend minorities. So then, like, if you're in a country,
I'm more talking about just
kind
the
of a minority
ability to be popular. I'm not even talking about just at the level of ruling. Like, I more mean like a doctrine that is you can call godless is going to be harder to sell to people who believe in God. It's like very simple. I mean, like America, the most powerful talking point against communism has always been godless communism. In Latin America, like socialism also didn't go, like Marxism didn't go that far, and you had liberation theology ultimately prop up because like that resonated in a certain sense.
Yeah, but the problem, like, first of all, just 2 points. There's been a huge process of, I'm not saying like your analysis wouldn't be correct at certain times, but there's been a huge process of like social adaptation that communist parties have gone through. You know, some did it better than others. But you know, like it's tremendously nuanced, the actual policies, you know, like in Russia, for example, like if you go to Kazan City, it's a Soviet policy was set up. Like if you build an Orthodox church, you have to build a mosque, right? Because you can't have like more Orthodox churches than mosques. And it was a measure that was taken against religious imperialism, for example. So there was so much adaptation, but also understanding that in a lot of these places, like they didn't have the same relationship to religion that we have today in the West. Like, oh, this is like your private worship. And I mean, okay, so it just does become very politicized at some time in a lot of cases. But I'm saying, like, you know, in the West, you have a relatively privatized relation to religion, right? And this is especially true if you look at, you know, European states in comparison to the West, for example. And it's like they were dealing with societies where religion was directly like linked to exploitative material structures of production, right? Tibet, you know, 99% of people were basically serfs and slaves before the communists came in, right? You know, and the effective head of state was like the Dalai Lama. So, you know, this is basically like an horrendously exploitative theocracy. Right?
I agree.
So it's like, you know, in that context, what do you say? Like, okay. And they did. They actually did try to.
No, it's not like there's many ways in which you can be not like for atheist doctrine and still not support organized religion, like class structures. Like, I mean, the Protestant Reformation opposed the church for a reason. I mean, like the founding fathers of America, I actually think had a very good approach to religion in some respects. And that's, they ultimately, you know, didn't even really believe God was involved on planet Earth for the most part. They're like deists, but they thought, you know, what's the point of policing, you know, policing people's religious lives? And also, I mean, it might be good actually for fostering community, you know, to have some religion. I think, you know, that's the Tocqueville's points, right? I think there's something to that. Actually, in my view, like I'm pro-religion, so I think actually Christianity It's good for socialism, and socialism
No
is
socialist
necessary
has
for
ever had
Christianity.
this idea that Tony's had here. No socialist has ever thought this. No socialist has ever pursued this.
No, many have, and I agree with those socialists. That's the thing. I agree with those socialists. I'm the atheism in Marxism is one of my biggest gripes.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
getting back to the
No,
topic.
I'm not saying this is not unique at all. My whole point is that actually they would have probably the atheistic communist parties might have had more success if they actually like were took a position that was more dominant with like the population.
And there are lots of cases. I mean, this was an issue in Afghanistan, because the Soviet Union, who had a pretty, reasonable understanding of how these things work, they said to them, like, stop trying to impose atheism on the population because, like, it's not going to work. Like, you just have too much religion in Afghanistan, right? So you got to slow down, right, in what you're doing, and the government there was kind of charging ahead, hand on the horn, and that was a lot of what generated the elements of militancy, right, that coalesced in the Mujahideen, that then received, the support of the U.S. and other nations that, eventually toppled the government and caused the Taliban to take power. Now, they did last a few years, unlike the U.S. that lasted like a week or something. So it's a testament to that the organic basis of support for socialism was much greater than, the U.S. government later. But yeah, so no, I mean, there are lots of cases in which what you're saying is true. But to get back to the point that we were talking about different, like, some people, I'm sure, when they hear me talk, they're going to be like, this guy's, just advocating like, left liberalism. I mean, we have to separate out two things here. We have to separate out, organizing people who aren't necessarily proletariat, within a Marxist-oriented framework. For example, like a Marxist feminism that recognizes the significance of social reproduction, right, to the overall economy, and organizing people in a liberal framework or identitarian framework, right, that rejects Marxism, right, and that, claims a kind of false independence, right, from the proletariat at a national level or potentially, and what would be increasingly more likely at a global level, right? So I think this is kind of the problem, right? And this is part of what Althusser's point was about May 68. It was the failure of the students, in a sense, to fully understand like the necessity of the workers or the importance of their intervention, right? And by the way, I'm not blaming like the fault of that, but if we talk about the ideological evolution that's going on, right? When we get the shift into post-structuralism, right? Which initially does have, certain strong links with Marxism in spite of clear differences. But that, as we were talking before this conversation, in America in particular, becomes formalized in a certain way and almost kind of like an upper middle class academic doctrine that's wielded against Marxism, at that level. So we have to differentiate between those things. And like, I categorically reject, identity-based or liberalistic approaches that have no grounding in that. I mean, I think Adolf Reed, for example, is completely right about Black Lives Matter when he says, like, look, like, there is a disproportionate amount of police violence towards Blacks because class in the United States is racialized. But there's no evidence that if we look at, white people in similarly precarized conditions, that there's less police violence based on admittedly incomplete, statistical basis, right? But he also raises the question of like, he's like, we're not in the Jim Crow era, right? So really the best thing we should be doing is organizing on a universal basis, right? Because we need to build a coalition between whites and Blacks, right? That's going to be able to bring about, e.g., the kinds of universal programs, for example, that would benefit America, right? And would disproportionately benefit Black people. I mean, if you had universal healthcare, that disproportionately benefits Black people, right? So it's like the problem would be perceiving these interests as antagonistic, whereas in many respects, they're actually complementary in how they function, right? So I want to articulate like my distance. But what I want to also say is that I think, again, from and within,
I'm in full agreement there, by the way. I'm in full agreement there. Like I had Torrey Reed, Adolf Reed's son, on the show to discuss his book Towards Freedom, and then it was excellent conversation.
It's like a dynasty. Like, I didn't know he had a son.
Yeah, and honestly, I have to admit, like, I actually think I like Torrey's book more than Class Notes because it's more organized and like presents the argument that Adolf Reed makes more, I think, coherently in his talks. But it's like straightforward in one book. Whereas Class Notes, I find Class Notes a bit like it's a kind of everywhere. You know what I mean? It's like a bunch of essays more than it is a coherent book, right?
Mhm,
But I still agree with both. They make the same point pretty much. Just I think Tory Reid's his book is more likely to actually change the mind of a person who's steeped in identity politics.
mhm, mhm, mhm. Well, and like it speaks to one of the problems, and it's something we discuss in the book, because again, the book does take the form of a kind of debate over the viability of Marxist humanism and democratic socialism, right? In a practical sense, right? Whereas my sort of takeaway from, the failure of the Sanders movement, for example, and many similar things, Syriza, Corbyn, and so on. My takeaway from this would be that, there's a great quote by Frederick Jameson. He says, we have to support social democracy because its failure is the necessary condition for the emergence, or its inevitable failure is the necessary condition for the emergence of an authentic left. Right. So I don't think you look at that and then you say, okay, let's just like neurotically keep doing the same thing. Right.
Or I actually think kind of the opposite is true as well, but in that like the emergence of a radical left's necessary for social democracy, which was
we
actually
were just talking about complementary relations.
Yeah, it's the same thing. No, that's what I mean. It's the same thing. And it means the same thing, but it's like that's the difference is that like that would be something for the social democrats, and that was ultimately what made me sympathetic to communists, despite not being one. Was ultimately the fact that everywhere I looked where social democracy was ever successful, there was a corresponding communist movement on the horizon, and like therefore you can't like envision a world where like you just have social democracy brought up randomly without communists. I mean, we're in a world where Bernie Sanders is seen as the radical left. It shouldn't be that way. Bernie Sanders should be seen as the center left at most, right? And that's what we should be getting towards if anything can ever happen, right?
No, and if those communist movements are destroyed, what you get is like an openly reactionary version of social democracy historically, which many would term fascism, right? So
yeah, So you mean like the SPD after they killed Rosa Luxemburg?
Well, I mean, like we're like the Nazis when they wiped out all the communists, right?
I don't believe. So. Or I guess if you want to say, I don't think. I think the Nazis were actually in many ways more capitalistic than any other country in the world. I mean, Mussolini is different. Mussolini was like a kind of, you could say, authoritarian social democracy in some ways.
Yeah.
But like the Nazis, I mean, they like privatized industries and stuff, and
of course,
hyper productive. And
but at the same time, like the way that they conceived the organization of the state and the role of the government within the economy would have been inconceivable if not for what happened in Russia, for example, right? And that partly had to do with the way that Lenin kind of conceptualized like the state of exception.
Oh, I see. Okay.
As a
new like basis. Fascism is the shadow of communism.
Yeah, in that way. Right.
Yeah.
But what I was saying is like when you had enough kind of pressure coming from the left, right? What you would get is a sort of social democratic capitalism, right? But I'm saying if you actually had the extinguishing of the left within a context in which, it was nevertheless increasingly becoming the norm that state intervention was necessary to do things like, mitigating against depressions and so forth, what you would often get is a kind of fascist structure, right? So, we can debate all the finer points of that. But I think that what I take, from the failures of the last few years, is that we need to take it further. And I think one of the big problems that we've been coming up against is like, if you go to people within democratic socialism, right? If you talk to them, they have this like bizarre kind of superego where they're like, oh, we don't want to like sound too crazy. We have to like stay within the ambit of, acceptable kind of liberal sounding positions. And it's like, look at what the far right is doing, man. Like, it's like, it's just insane, right? In terms of the kind of, discourses that they lean into. And we can disagree and find a lot of that odious, as I do.
It all depends on what you mean by like what parts of that are sounding radical.
Well, I mean, like
Trump refusing. Some ways I might agree with that. Some ways I don't.
Trump refusing to disavow the Proud Boys, to give you like one example.
Oh
right?
yeah.
And, or the kinds of people often who are even going on to like Joe Rogan and the sort of things they're saying.
Yeah, that didn't help his popularity.
Well, we could.
Trump was way more popular the second time around when he moderated all his positions.
But yeah, well, we can discuss all this. But the point is just to say that, I think that, there's so much anger, right, that currently exists, towards the system because of decades of, increasing class polarization, right, which have arisen out of neoliberalism. We can talk about superstructural causes as well, right? Like, the role of the internet in enabling certain forms of non-status quo expression, for better and for worse, right? But the anger is so great that I think that part of the problem here is that when you try to remain within the ambit of these, status quo positions, right, you fail to communicate with the anger of the public. And the right has done an amazing job in terms of, not just obviously mystifying, the real causes of what's going on, but also, channeling anger on that basis, right? So sort of transmuting, anger over these real causes, right, into anger towards different groups, and not disavowing, even forms of, sort of chauvinistic social radicalism in that process. So obviously, I'm very opposed to all that. But my point here is just to say that, I feel like the range of possible political expressions is really, really wide, right? Like, and I think it's kind of bizarre. Like, we have all these things in our head, I mean, of course, like if you come in and you say that you're far left, like you're going to be opposed by, major capital interests as you always would be. And, I'm not, so sure.
Yeah, I think it depends on the idea too, the policy. Because like if you say, for example, abolishing the family, I think that that would scare away most people.
Yeah, I'm
But
not
for
saying
example,
just
like to test to the part where I agree with the sentiment of what you're saying is that like there are these like social democrat libs, right, who will, any idea that is like outside of the moderate left, they'll think is, oh, we can't do that. Like, I'll give you an example. Like if I were, some radical left ideas sound crazy to a lot of people. Some sound crazy in theory, but to people I actually talk to who aren't like in, political world 24/7, don't seem very crazy. Like, okay, the idea I've noticed about like, stateless, classless, moneyless society, most people I talk to don't believe in it. But for example, an idea that social democrats would probably find way too radical, which I do notice a lot of people don't find that crazy, is the idea that like you should have a limitation on the amount of properties you own that you don't live in, right? Like, how no one should own, why should you own more than like 2-3 properties, if you're not like living in them, right? What is like, why is there any case you can justify that? How is that good for civilization? A lot of people like I've talked to, like conservatives, will say, I mean, yeah, it's crazy. Like, even you'll have conservatives sometimes be on board with, like I saw with the Zohan thing. Zohan wanted to, with some of his like housing policies, I saw some conservatives reply to him saying, I hope he seizes all the Chinese Communist Party owned property, which I thought was kind of funny, because it's like, okay, well, you're obviously not against violating private property rights here. You know what I mean? And it's like it's not like unimaginable that, some people even on the right might support like, not like politicians, but you know what I mean? Like regular people would support like, essentially tackling the oligarchy, which I think, to be clear, I think that would involve like an actual socialist government, not like a moderate social democracy, because historically they don't really do that. It's really only the radical democratic socialist, or radical, which democratic socialist is like, I would say, the radical social democracy, who have tried to do that, right? But like most of the time they don't touch that area. Like the Labour Party in England they didn't try to do stuff like that. And most still do wealth taxes, right?
Yeah. Well, I think the real issue here is like that, the idea that kind of guided democratic socialism in a lot of ways was like, okay, we're going to like parachute a candidate in, like we can do a bit entryism, whatever. It's different in different countries. But this sort of spontaneous notion, right, that you could capitalize upon the discontent that was created basically out of the Great Recession and parlay that into dominance over bourgeois parties, or maybe win with a separate party within a coalitional system or whatever in short order. And, I think that I'm not like against trying to do this, right? Like, but I think we also have to soberly recognize the need for, independent organization, right? That champions like a very different set of ideas, right? That doesn't conform, right, to the status quo of politics in this way. and to increasingly normalize that. So, I think one of the big problems now is like, we're increasingly seeing that, this line has become so concerned with this kind of respectability politics that it's actually driven a wedge between itself, and the kinds of grassroots support that it would need to accomplish these goals. So we see this within, with what in the book, like I'm critical of what I call the DSA Jacobin line, right? But even this is a little bit of a misnomer, because, I think a few years ago, right, like the left of the DSA actually got like a slight majority. I have to go over and like look at the details, and I think Jacobin was predominantly associated with the Bread and Roses caucus, right, and groups that were very committed to working inside the Democratic Party, essentially. And my understanding is that the magazine has more and more sort of taken a bit of distance from the DSA as an organization as it's gone left this way. So it's functioning a little bit like its own party, right? So this is case in point. And by the way, Jacobin runs all kinds of great stuff. Like I'm not, plenty of other positions I agree with. I'm not engaging in any kind of, undifferentiated condemnation. But I do think it's an issue because I do think we need to lean in, right, to more radical elements of our constituency, and try to achieve something different, but also equally sophisticated to what the far right has been able to do, right, in terms of leaning into radical aspects of their constituency. So that becomes an important, and the debate over humanism and Marxist science, as it were, is very important to this, right? Because if you look at somebody like Althusser, he was very wary of humanism, right?
Before you introduce that
Yeah.
rabbit hole, we have to save that for after, because people are going to be like, what? Anti-humanism? You're against humans? There's a lot to break down.
Yeah, I hate all humans. I want them to die.
We should save that. We should save that for the backroom segment, because
Okay.
I wanted to
Suffice
first
it
get
to say, it to say that that many people will see in humanism, from a Marxist standpoint, a commitment to a continuity of bourgeois institutions, right? Which is why that debate has importance in the book. So I don't know where you want to go from here. If you want to roll into the back room, or
I wanted to first kind of get into like a couple more things with democratic socialism, because that's a big point of debate between you and Matt McManus in Flowers for Marx. Matt has the chapter in defense of Marxist humanism, and you have a response right after that in the following chapter. If I recall correctly, you have a point, you do bring up the point about Chile trying democratic socialism under Salvador Allende, which was, of course, shut down by a coup by General Pinochet. And you kind of use that as an example as to why democratic socialism has limitations, or maybe even implying that it doesn't work.
correct?
I see this argument a lot, especially in Marxist-Leninist circles. And in fact, it was a big role in my own kind of radicalization. In fact, learning about the Allende case many years ago was kind of what made me sympathetic to Leninism, despite not fully going that way, but sympathetic to that and sympathetic to the Soviet Union in ways that I wasn't before, given, these obstacles. However, I don't really see, I find the ways in which Salvador Allende gets used by some Marxist-Leninists to be a little strange in terms of the conclusion, because the way I interpret that event, and I'm curious what you think of this, is I don't see it as evidence that democratic socialism doesn't work. I just see it simply that, the peaceful transition to socialism is naive, right? I don't see those as the same thing. In that, I think socialism can still be not a one-party dictatorship. It doesn't have to be, completely illiberal at the level of how it governs its population. But what Allende didn't do is, he ultimately didn't want to use the repressive state apparatus to squash political dissidents, which any state that wants to survive has to do to some extent, right? In any country, if there was a plotted coup, it's not like they're going to violate liberal norms to essentially, purge the military of potential dissenters. I mean, any country that would want to survive does that. I mean, look, even Lula, right? Lula had, social democrat, very moderate social democrat. And there was that kind of January 6th event, right? They experienced their own January 6th. And what did he do? He's persecuting the people who were trying to, a very poor attempt at trying to overthrow the government. And I think that's justified. Every state would respond that way, right?
Yeah.
And I like in Allende, he had the first coup against him before the second one ended up working. I mean, I see that more as like incompetence on his part at the level of not wanting to be as, I guess, Machiavellian enough. But I don't see that as evidence socialism can't be democratic or has to be this like one party state and, have, doesn't not having like constitutional limitations on the state's power and stuff. Like, yeah, that's my view of it.
I mean, like, I'm not saying you're wrong hypothetically, but the thing is that if you look at the actual experience that these states went through, right, attempting to achieve this kind of transition placed them in almost like a permanent state of emergency, right? So we know in Russia, of course, like, there was 12 imperial powers that intervened, right?
Yeah,
We
yeah,
know that
okay.
there was a 6-year civil war. We know that, like, so, and it sure is
I want you to elaborate. I want you to elaborate on that particular point because it's important for the audience to know what I'm responding to. Because like I actually very much disagree with that entire narrative, but like I want you to lay it out so that like we can hear the audience can hear.
Yeah, well, what I meant to say is that in all of these cases,
with Russia specifically,
well, with Russia, yeah, I mean, I'm not like an expert in every step of the revolution, but I'm a philosopher by training. But of course, you had the February Revolution, and then you had Kerensky and others who were in power, right? And they were, the monarchy stayed sort of behind the scenes, but they were to withdraw Russia from the First World War, right? Which was resulting in mass death and created like a kind of popular plank that Lenin was able to exploit, right? In order to consolidate rule after the October Revolution. But then you had like 12 different countries that, entered Russia in order to contribute to the restoration of order, as it were. So,
see, you're just
like,
but this is I notice the Leninists skip over like 4 years when they do that. And that's pretty important because I actually don't believe that the one party state was necessary in the Soviet Union because at the beginning, after the October Revolution, even after the Bolsheviks, there was a period where there was multiple parties and multiple socialist parties, in fact. Like, so this is important because yes, immediately after the February Revolution, there was already attempts that of like the whites to overthrow, like Kornilov. There was the coup Kornilov was planning, right? General Kornilov, and in fact, part of Lenin's justification for why the October Revolution should happen, why like October takeover, let's be more precise. I mean, it was a coup. I just think it was justified, but it was a coup. And part of the October was one, Kerensky government failing, but also really, I mean, the big thing why the October happens is because he wanted to protect the Constituent Assembly. I mean, that's how the Bolsheviks justified it, that we are actually protecting democracy. Because, if in the event that there was a coup, like that would put an end to the ideal of the prospect of socialist democracy completely. So they justified on that basis of democracy. Like Lenin is saying the Constituent Assembly is what he wants to defend. This is like what would later be demonized as parliamentary bourgeois democracy. He was defending that because that was the Marxist position at the time. That was the Marxist position. And why the Bolsheviks, I mean, because they didn't have the general population behind them because it was mostly peasants, but they had the soldiers behind them because they were the most anti-war party, by far, most consistently anti-war party. You got a lot of soldiers, a lot of arms. They were capable of defending the revolution in a way that the other parties weren't. You had that. Now, after that, though, you get a lot of attempts between the three parties, which are the SRs and then their separate ones, right and left SRs, and the Mensheviks, to kind of govern. And you had other parties too, but they were right wing, but they were very marginal, not popular, like the Cadets, very tiny. Most of the population was solidly socialist at the level of like the political representation. You had many disagreements as to what kind of socialism that was, right? In the interpretations of Marxism, but you still had like multi-party, democracy, really. But then you get, after a series of attempts to compromise on things, you get a series of, essentially moves to like what is a one-party dictatorship. Like you have, you have the banning of the press. Then you get the banning. The first party to get banned was kind of its own fault, really. The right SRs who disagreed with the treaty, right? But banning the party set a legal precedent that made it so that you could ban other parties without a very strong legal basis. And after that, banning that first party, which, I kind of get the nuance of, they ended up banning all the parties. And not only that, they ended up banning like the party's participation in the Soviets, because how Lenin justified the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly. He didn't say he's getting rid of democracy. He said he was going to have stronger democracy, Soviet democracy, which he didn't, wasn't that like, he was more of a moderate on before, right? He wasn't a council communist, but now suddenly becomes a bit of a council communist, and now really says he wants to give all power to the Soviets. But what does this actually do? Like this council, it was a really excuse to dissolve the Constituent Assembly. And then even after the damn Mensheviks, SRs try to participate in that form of government, they still got policed after. And what happened? A lot of people, it's not that the Civil War created a one-party dictatorship. Rather, the one-party dictatorship made the Civil War last longer than it would have, in the sense that you had a lot of people who did not fight on the side of the Bolsheviks, didn't join the whites, but who didn't fight on the side of the Bolsheviks because they were essentially marginalized politically. And some did join the whites. So some right SRs joined the whites in ways that they wouldn't have before if they were simply integrated and allowed to participate legally. And I think if you make political opposition illegal and you have a monopoly on power, well, what happens? They're going to use illegal means to oppose the government. And that's kind of why Kautsky, he warned in Terrorism and Communism that you would get a government without legitimacy that will have to rely on force alone to rule. And, Trotsky, tries to defend this in his rebuttal, which is more known than the original thing he was responding to.
But quite rich as well. He was given his own role in, perpetuating a lot of these things.
Yeah, well, Trotsky, that's the thing. I find the idea of Trotsky as some kind of Democrat hilarious. Like Trotsky was more totalitarian than anyone else, at the time,
Yeah,
like,
well, but I do think to his credit, there's a difference between justifying those things as what you imagine to be like emergency measures, right? That will recede quickly enough. And then watching,
in political. So this is one thing I always, I like people when it comes to political theory classes to read Carl Schmitt together with that particular Trotsky book, Terrorism and Communism, because I actually make the same argument, but from very different ideological standpoints. But they both basically advocate for absolute power in the need of an emergency, and that it's decided by a sovereign. The only difference is that Schmitt is much more overt about the sovereign being a dictator, and Trotsky, it's like the party dictatorship, but the proletariat party dictatorship. But it's ultimately they end up creating the same end results, for different reasons. And that's right. I'm not trying to equate fascism and communism in any way. But they end up creating a similar kind of state at the level of just a powerful state that has no limits. And I believe you need state capacity. It can't be an enfeebled state, but you can't. I'm not an anarchist or one of these decentralized local type socialist. I believe in limits on power, and I think that's almost the greatest lesson of the 20th century. That's, if anything,
right.
What do most socialists even agree that was the biggest failure of communism is the states were just way too damn powerful. And I think it's not just Stalin; it was the nature of the Soviet Union. It wasn't just
I agree with you about I think a big part of it was later on was the failure to transition away from a top-down industrial model that was kind of reaching the end of its tether in terms of its economic efficacy. Right, which potentially would have created a different set of social relations that would have helped renew the political system. Right, and we see something like this in the Cultural Revolution. That having been said, right, we can go through all the particulars of it, and I don't wish to justify every anti-democratic action that was taken by these states. However, I do think that what you're going to encounter is that when you're trying to achieve a very ambitious transformation of society, right? And when you're up against not just in all kinds of internal resistance, right, but all kinds of external resistance as well, that, it becomes very natural to try to consolidate power in that way, right? I don't think that that's necessarily the problem. I think the bigger problem is, the incapacity to terminate that state of exception at a certain point.
Yeah, they had a there's a lot of thinkers who wrote about that, right? And
Yeah.
it's
And
all
to be fair, like,
the
that's not,
Republicans, the
yeah.
founding fathers, Machiavelli. That's why I'm a big Machiavelli enjoyer. The
Yeah.
discourses.
And what does he say? He says, every republic must create its own people. Right. And what he means by that is like, it can't simply be a
Civilian
matter of,
militia. But also,
yeah,
that's his call for elections. Like the whole point of elections is not like direct democracy or any sense. The election is just a way to like put a limit on power.
Mhm.
Like imagine how much easier it would have made the life of the Soviet Union, where you didn't have all the leaders overthrown through like coups and like power struggles the population had no part in, like Brezhnev, Khrushchev.
It's very
all very backroom.
It's very destabilizing, because if the system doesn't have like a traditional transitional mechanism, right, then that's a big problem. I mean, in a certain way, and for like all its faults, like, a place like Canada is like more stable than any socialist state has ever been, right? Because it has like a set of processes that, while not incorruptible, right, and there are certain fragilities in our system, particularly because in the Canadian system, I won't go on at this length, particularly because we retired a bunch of like monarchical vestiges or deprived them of power. But the result was we basically have like a unicameral kind of governance. So if you win like a majority government in Canada, you basically become like a dictator, right? Because no one other.
Yeah, with constitutional limits, right? So that's why I prefer a system to the American system. The American system has too much checks in that, like, there's this, given all the chambers of government, but like, which is why I prefer, the Canadian system, where, if you have a majority, you can actually kind of govern, but there's still constitutional limits, right? Like there's legal precedents in a way that like Canada can't persecute opposition in the way that Sisi in Egypt can, right? Like,
I
think socialist states ought to have these sort of things. Like, I don't think this is
at least until their own state of emergency, of course. But also, society is much more dialogic, right? If you look at the media and everything, even as it is piloted by narrow bourgeois interests, like, is a greater, at least theoretical range for discussion. So like, no, like, I think the failure is not, to me, the failure to me would not be, we can recite all the factors, but the failure to me would not be with the USSR or any other state. It would not be at an initial stage, right? Aiming to take power like that. It would be failing to get out of that situation, right? And to create, a more continuous social structure and fluid social structure, and one that's more adaptable, because this is kind of the idea, right? Like, you go through this period, you solidify your rule, you solidify the ideology, you transform education, right? To make people supportive of a doctrine, that is much more secular and equalitarian in nature, right? And so on. Right. And then
does that work though? So this is the thing. I'm actually opposed to the state trying to morph people into morph human. Like, I think human nature is contingent on conditions, but that's precisely why the state can't really like force human nature to change with it. Human nature will just change as like they have to adapt to new social relations, because like one common thread I hear a lot from people who lived in former Soviet bloc countries is there'll be like a part like often actually has like a big romanticism for some of the securities of like the welfare state and stuff. But one thing that I hear a lot is that everyone was like taught Marxism-Leninism and no one believed it. It's like this phenomenon.
Yeah, because it becomes very sclerotic and dogmatized.
I would say it's true of Catholicism too.
Yeah, and that's
like when you try to force like.
It's a huge problem. It's a huge problem, right? Because like, when something becomes simply state ideology, right? And you're not encouraged to think critically about it, because God forbid, we ask people to take the power into their own hands to think critically about politics and society. These are big problems. But I also want to say that the failure to transition out of a state of emergency was not just a fault of internal governance, right? It was also like a fault of like an entire global and political situation. Right. And like, even like, ask yourself, like, what animates, the sort of messianism or democratic impulse of Lenin, right? Because Lenin was imagining himself to be doing something in a state of exception, right? Like that's very clear, right? Now you can dispute what he did, but this is what he imagined himself to be doing. It was the belief that the Russian Revolution was going to spread elsewhere, right? It was going to
Yeah.
be
I
the
think he
spark.
would have just got. I honestly think if the Russian Revolution spread elsewhere, you would have just got the situation you got after World War II sooner, which is like a bunch of one-party dictatorships. I mean, I have no way of knowing that. That's purely hypothetical.
Right,
This is
right,
not
right.
very
I'm sure you would have. I'm sure you would have. But the point is that they would have had the means within them at that point to transition out of the state of emergency.
But that's where I don't believe it. This is where I have a huge gripe with the way dialectical materialism is used. It's used as a way to kind of like say like justify everything pretty much because of material conditions, and I don't buy that I don't buy that at all. Like I think there's politics is an intervention into history, and politics,
of course, politics.
and
matters.
like look, a good example of a state that had plenty of difficult conditions to deal with, in many ways where the odds for it to be democratic were up against it, is the United States. The United States after the American Revolution, had completely opposite political economies in the North and South. It had the British, who were far more powerful militarily, and always the threat of them invading again, which they did try in 1812, after America got a little ballsy with Canada, right? But, they had a lot of things to be afraid of in terms of obstacles. George Washington, famously had the opportunity to be a dictator. He really could have been a dictator. He had the arms to do so. He had the popularity to do so. Chose not to. And, because the founding fathers, they weren't like, what they saw themselves as doing is not democracy, I should add. It's not democracy in any sense. But it was what you could call Republican liberal governance, in the sense that they wanted to limit power. And they had a real genuine belief in that. Like, I think that there's nothing, that's not just bourgeois ideology. That's an experience of...
They wanted to limit the power of whom? They wanted to limit the power
property owners, but also that meant small property owners,
right?
Right. That meant small property
owners. Who are we know? Was it first 13 of the first 16?
Yeah, but that's important. They didn't say
13 of the first 16 U.S. presidents were slave owners.
Yeah. The point about...
Do you really think the early U.S. was more democratic than the Soviet Union? I'm just asking.
No, I measured countries relative to their time, as Marxists often do, right? And Marxists don't ever do this.
Now you have your own.
Marxists throw dialectical materialism out the window when it comes to America, but when it comes to every other socialist country, suddenly nuance is there. But
but to be fair, American slavery,
America was more democratic than anywhere in the world.
Is historically exceptional, to be clear, in terms of the scope.
Yeah, but what I mean is it didn't have to turn out the way it did. It could have easily gone the way of France. It could have easily become a sort of dictatorship. It could have. There was no guarantee of history that it was.
Yeah, but even that's not a flat, because if you look at France, if you look at what happened there, a lot of that had to do with, the strength of vested feudal interests, right? Whereas it was possible to create this.
Yeah, this is the limitation
amongst the commercial class of the United States. It was possible to create this consensus among the commercial slave owning class of the United States, right? Because they didn't need to create a Robespierre as a battering ram, right, against vested class interests, right? So I'm not trying to dismiss the importance of politics. It absolutely is a factor.
You're always going to encounter resistance. So this is why I when I hear that kind of idea, they have resistance to deal with, you're always going to have resistance. Yeah. There's counter-revolution with every revolution, with progress as reaction, all the time. If there's justification of this kind of state of exception politics, it's a very dangerous position, because what really matters is you just need to have the political structures in place that prevent that. Not we'll deal with it later and transition after. All the communist countries, the ones that did learn the lesson learned it way too late. Mao, right, ended up saying the obstacle to socialism is the Communist Party itself, right, and the Cultural Revolution. Except unlike Mao, I don't think throwing a bunch of students at the party to scare the shit out of them into being socialist is really worked. I think, ultimately you need a rotation of parties. And, you said democracy for whom? For the founding fathers. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It was like a property owning democracy, as they would call it. Mm-hmm. But it's not one party. There's no one party that has a monopoly. And I think under a socialist society where no democracy is ostensibly supposed to be for the propertyless majority and the working class majority, the working class is more diverse, if anything, than the bourgeoisie. there's no reason to believe that there needs to be a one-party dictatorship.
No, so
I
to
think
give you an
you
example,
can have multiple socialist parties.
give you an
govern.
example of the importance of politics. So politics is conditioned by a certain range of material factors. But to give an example of the importance of politics, of course, like the question that Mao was, the animus driving the Cultural Revolution was, as you say, like the recognition of an internal bourgeoisie within the party, right? And the designs that they were pursuing in the Cultural Revolution obviously didn't succeed, right? In spite of, there was a lot of hardship. There were certain positive things that happened in terms of the expansion of education, primary, and so on to people in the country, but it didn't succeed. So then you had Deng, who was there, right? And he made what was also like a very political choice, right? No, it was materially conditioned in the sense that the party was actually so hollowed out that it was much harder for it to function in the same top-down ways before. But he made what was also a political choice, which was to use markets, right? As a way of encouraging economic growth. But also it's not just about economic growth, right? Because when you begin to get markets and business entering the economy, right, then you begin to get, the elements of a bourgeois legal system, right? People become,
Yeah, I disagree with that too.
shareholders within society. I'm not saying that market relations are innocent. That's not my point.
No,
But
okay, I'll let you finish. My
point is, but I'm not saying that what he did was without its problems. But my only point, right, is that if you were to give the examples of the Soviet Union and China, I don't think it's theoretically impossible. The conditions were not the same, but I don't think it's theoretically impossible that the Soviet Union could have pursued like a similar process of reform, right, towards the market, right? But this in a way was the problem, right, was that there had reached an impasse within history where it seemed that the only options that were really available to people, and in a way this was sort of confirmed in a sense to many because of the failure of the Cultural Revolution, were, this kind of, state-led top-down model, right? Or, the shift towards the normalization of markets, right? So those were the options that seemed apparent, right? In terms of their material availability, right? So of course politics is important, but politics is also conditioned, right? And I think that it's very important to keep both of those things in mind when we're pursuing any kind of analysis. It was great talking to you, and I appreciate it. And guys, if you're interested in these kind of debates, if you like this debate, I think you should really check out the book Flowers for Marx by Revolt Press with myself, Matt McManus, Ben Burgess, Ernesto Vargas, forward by Daniel Tutt. And I think a lot of what we're discussing in that book, though perhaps a little bit more theoretical in its presentation at times, really bears strongly on the debate I had with Tony tonight. So Thanks so much, Tony. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll have another time to do this. So
100%. Yeah, go pick up the book. It features pretty much all of the authors have been on the show now. So, if you like what they have to say and are interested, check it out. I highly recommend it. See you in the next episode.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimists, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.